Dan Ives of Wedbush has this to say. There is one chip in the world fueling the AI revolution, and it's Nvidia. The AI revolution is heading into its next gear of growth despite the Trump tariff war playing out. Dan joins us now for more. Dan, good morning.
Great to be here.
What did you like most yesterday?
I mean, look, the godfather of AI, Jen-Hsun, delivered yet again. And I think if you look demand outstripping supply, we believe 8-1. And despite the China tariffs, I mean, I think if you look apples to apples, that would have been a $53 billion number compared to where the street, apples to apples, would have been at $48 billion. I think it just shows there's only one chip fueling this AI revolution. It's Jen-Hsun and Nvidia.
There's a question of whether they'll be allowed to fuel that AI revolution. In other words, if they will be allowed to move into China in the way that they kind of need to longer term in order to maintain that dominance. What about yesterday gave you that confidence, given the fact that there still are some pretty existential risks about their ability to operate in China?
Yeah, I know you'll talk to Navarro after. Look, the reality is that Jen-Hsun and Nvidia are essentially giving away their China business on a silver platter. Huawei, here's our business. And that's the reality. And I think more and more, there's going to have to be some negotiation where they're enabled behind, right now, back against the wall. They need to have a chip that U.S. sanctioned that they can sell into China. Because otherwise, all you're doing here is you're cutting them off at the knees, and Huawei is getting that market. And that's the reality. And I think that was a shot across the bow last night from Jen-Hsun. They are in a position of strength. There's one chip in the world fueling it. They continue to see demand that's, I believe, staggering.
There was sort of a subtle narrative shift. There's been a tone from the administration, both this one as well as the Biden administration, that the way to curtail China's advance is to limit some of the exports of U.S. chips and U.S. technology to the world's second biggest economy. It seemed like Jen-Hsun Huang was saying that's not right. They're actually catching up. And if we separate ourselves, we're going to fall behind. How much is that catching on in any kind of policy circles, but also within the tech circles?
Yeah, I mean, as someone like myself, I've spent so much of my career, in China, in Taiwan, throughout Asia. That's unrealistic to think that China's just going to sit there. I mean, if you put them in a box with 2 toothpicks, seltzer water, and sunglasses, they come out with a chip. So the reality is you don't want to give them fuel. And I think that's what Jen-Hsun's talking about. You have some of the best engineers in the world. Right now, for the first time in 30 years, the U.S. is ahead of China when it comes to tech. Don't cut U.S. tech off at the knees. And I think that speaks to Nvidia, speaks to Apple. And I think those are some of the things that you're hearing across the board that we're seeing in tech. And I think that's some of the damage and the balancing act that you guys see with these tariffs.
Do you think Jen-Hsun Huang then is going to have the company develop a chip that is export compliant to go into China?
100%.
But why would he do that if he did that with the H20 and then the United States said you can't sell it?
It speaks in negotiation because it comes down to, like, Jen-Hsun also recognizes in the Middle East and the red carpet tour, and the reality is, what's that tour without Jen-Hsun? What happens to Jen-Hsun? Yeah, we're not going to sell in the Middle East. I mean, it just speaks to, like, our biggest chips on the table, it's Nvidia, it's Apple, in terms of broader negotiations.
But why would China want to buy a lesser chip when Jen-Hsun Huang is saying himself that Huawei, which is blacklisted by the United States, is quite formidable?
Look, and I think that right now is like they're going to come up with there's something like beyond an H200, less than a Blackwell, some sort of converted chip, because they need to stay ahead of Huawei in the China market. And that's why when you look at the reaction here, why tech's going to be up so much, despite even like the trade rule and everything we saw, it's because Nvidia shows that this AI revolution right now is the ripple effect, but it all starts with Nvidia.
Don't you think there's some tension brewing here?
100%.
The president doesn't want them selling into China. Jen-Hsun Huang's trying to create an argument that they should sell into China. The Wall Street Journal reporting this morning. I'll read this verbatim. Fresh accusations from U.S. lawmakers that the company is too close to China. They've received a letter from a Republican, Senator Jim Banks, a Democrat, Senator Elizabeth Warren, accusing them of being too close to the second largest economy on the planet. How do you actually think this is going to play out?
Look, I remember, it's easy, when you're in the beltway in front of a microphone, it's easy to say things, right? The reality of the markets are different. And I think it just comes down to U.S. tech. Part of why U.S. tech's leading China is that you need to have that market open up. And it speaks to the U.S.-China negotiations, why it's so important, not just for names like NVIDIA, but for Apple as well as the hyperscalers.
You say you need to have that market open up. Who's you?
U.S. tech needs that market.
Yes, US tech does. Washington, D.C. disagrees.
And
isn't that the ultimate point of tension? And I would argue who wins out? The person setting the rules, which is Washington, D.C.
And I would, and I think that point in tension has been there for years. But the reality is that by ultimately closing off that market, what you're essentially doing is you're cutting U.S. tech off at the knees, and on a silver platter, you're making China stronger. So it goes to the whole Twilight Zone, however you want to think about it, is that this is all giving China an upper hand. That's what Jen-Hsun's saying last night, is like, we're leading. You continue to go down this path, Huawei will continue to narrow the gap.
To build on what John is talking about, there was a feeling that national security concerns would take precedence over profitability, over this idea that the tech giants really were necessarily leading the world. Do you think that that argument has fallen apart and that this administration essentially has put tech giants and their dominance at the forefront, even ahead of national security?
And I think it's I think it speaks in, I think that Middle East trip was a watershed event, because it shows the AI revolution now coming to the Middle East. But what does that mean without Nvidia, without Amazon, without the hyperscalers?
Also, AI revolution coming to the Middle East with a caveat. They need to make sure there are guardrails so that these AI data centers do not have U.S. technology leaking to China. And
to your point, you can't have both. You can't have your cake and eat it too, right? The point is, like, how could you do it with the Middle East, but then China be like, okay, you can't have these chips, but we're going to sell next-gen Blackwell chips to Saudi, UAE. And I think that's part of the issue. Like, John, I think that's part of the issue here, is that, like, how do you balance that and talk out of both sides of your mouth? And the reality is, what Jen-Hsun's saying is, stop tying our hands behind our back. Stop giving this market to Huawei. Let us go after that market.